Well, today I'm joined by my friend from across the pond, Phillip Blond. Phillip is the founder of Res Publica think tank and the director of the think tank. He's advised multiple British prime ministers. He has an art gallery in London and also a notable book called Red Tory that he published back in 2010, criticizing the excesses of both the neoliberal right and left. Thanks for joining, Phillip.
Pleasure to be here.
So today we're here for you to actually make a pretty provocative argument, which is going to be the topic of a book that you're working on in the future, which is The Case for Empire. Now, to American ears, this sounds pretty strange for several reasons. One, because despite I think the reality of American empire, we like to deny the fact that we have an empire. So we don't like to recognize that. Secondly, empire, both from the left and right, has negative connotations. From the left, it's colonialism, cultural imperialism, etc. From the right, empire is what we had. That's what George Bush tried to revive with the neoconservatives. It was the democracy exportation, regime change, wars abroad, sort of the American sovereignty, the nation state, protecting our borders, this sort of nationalism that's nascent, not even nascent, is dominant, I think, in American discourse on the right. Right, sees empire as the great Satan. And so here you are making the case for a conservative Christian vision of universal empire. What's your argument?
Well, where does one begin? I think it's always a good idea to begin with history, and that is to say that since human beings emerged from kith and kin groups, that is tribal groups, empire has been the dominant mode of human political organization. And you might argue that continues to this day. In which case human beings have always lived under the auspices of empire, whether they know it or not. The rise of the nation state, I would argue, is relatively recent, and itself is the product of empire, that the empire structures that were then in place, for instance, the great rise of nationalism and the breakup of the European empires, at least in the 19th century, was itself authored and protected by empire. So largely, one might say that the governing logic of human civilization itself has the characters of empire, and that nation states, to the extent that they persist or survive over time, only do so because they're living under the auspices of an empire, whether they acknowledge it or not.
And what is the unique genius of an empire? What makes an empire as opposed to just a nation state?
Well, there never was just a nation state, is the way to argue that. The foundational, if we go back in human history, and the original human grouping are, as I've already said, family groups, come tribes. The moment you move beyond family groups to come tribes, you're in a logic of something that one can argue is only empire. Take, for example, kind of Athens, and lots of people want to argue there was such a thing as a city-state, as an intermediary between tribe and empire, and that the city-state is the alternative foundation for what we might call the nation-state today. But that isn't true. Athens herself became a city-state through structures of empire, imperialism, incorporating the villages in Attica around its polity, exercising rule through of Athens over its territory through building altars, through extending its religion and practices, through extending its rights, creating a premium for conformity. So even the nation state itself exhibits the logic of empire. And as such, its empire marks both the nation state and the self-avowed empire. So nation states don't emerge sui generis as one national group just from out of the woods, or the German marshes. They emerge through warfare, takeover, and the building of groups, partially and often in response to other groups that are threatening to come in and engage in the project of expansion and conquest.
So let's take America and go back to the time of the American founding. So we were part of the British Empire. Essentially we broke away, and then we conquered the entire continental United States, and then we took Hawaii, we took Philippines, we took the Panama Canal, right? This is kind of, so really the 19th century was the story of America conquering the West. We reached the ocean. Then the turn to the 20th century was we conquered sort of the near kind of the Western hemisphere. We dominated. And then in the 20th century with the world wars, and then the Cold War, we became the global hegemon. So in one sense, you could say, oh, that's just kind of the conventional story of, a nation or people becoming an empire, going from from kith and kin groups to empire, just that transition?
It's exactly the process I described. America never was a nation state. It always was essentially an outpost of empire that then broke away and became an empire in its own right. It has always been imperial, as you quite rightly outline, and its dimensions and reach has only ever expanded.
So it was an imperial republic?
Most republics are imperial.
Sure.
And it was imperial republic, and it has progressively and aggressively expanded its range, influence, and writ across the world until, as you quite rightly say, it became the global hegemon. And so there's a sense in which I would argue almost every nation exhibits this logic, and to attempt to project back onto that logic, a nation state where you always end up defining it racially or ethnically or by language group, is a type of category error. Now, I don't for a moment deny that nation states exist. Of course they do. But what I'm saying is they exist in the form they do as a result of geopolitical empires securing the conditions for their continued existence. And in the absence of such, i.e. in the absence of American hegemony, I very much doubt there would be a Europe made up of independent nation states at this moment. We would either have German-dominated Europe or a Russian-dominated Europe. So nation states aren't just there because they're there. They're only there because of empire and the work of empire.
So if history were to have, I know we can't escape history, right? But if it were to have played out differently in, let's say there was no American Revolution. What role, in your mind, and that probably would be preferable from your vantage point, what would America look like today? How would that have worked if America and Britain had stayed together?
Well, I mean, slavery would have ended earlier. You wouldn't have had the American Civil War. You would have had a more globalized polity. It probably would have looked, the federal solution is always a good one. And it probably would have looked something like, going fast forward, a transatlantic European Union, if I can put it like that. It would have looked something like, how do you govern kind of an expanded polity? And it would have been something of that order. It's in the nature of empires, though, that they find that very difficult to do. I mean, there are all sorts of constraints upon imperial reach, some of which are historically contingent, some of which are not. But it seems that those that last the longest are those that allow a maximal degree of subsidiarity, political, social, and economic, to their various constituent parts. One could, for instance, if things had played out differently, have had an empire stretching from America to India. And that would have required forms of political reform that were beyond the ability of the British to then conceive. It would have meant Indian MPs in the Houses of Parliament and American MPs in the Houses of Parliament. I mean, theoretically, one can see this. But what's interesting is looking at the longevity of empires. It's only empires that are capable of creating full participation in its governance that last. And that's how I imagine it could have gone.
And what about the relationship between Christianity and empire? So maybe if you could contrast it with various pagan empires, from maybe ones in ancient China or in the Americas or Egypt, Greeks, Rome. Like, what did Christianity change anything about empire?
Oh, well, look, first of all, we must be much more positive about empires than we are, regardless of whether they're Christian or not. Almost all empires recognize that they will collapse if they exact a penalty upon those they take over. So the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, the Romans, they all allowed participation of those they conquered in the regime and the goods of that regime very quickly. If you think of Alexander the Great, he was incredibly visionary. He encouraged his generals to marry into the elites of countries around the Black Coast. He was the first one so that they shared in the needs of those peoples. He didn't think of the peoples he conquered as conquered peoples, but as a form of universal citizenry. He himself, coming from Aristotle, who taught him that non-Greeks were barbarians, wanted to extend the benefits of his civilization to all. So it's already in the logic of all successful empires to create structures of participation. The real distinction in empires, which is a difficult one to make, is between those that enforce the rule of one group over all groups, and those that let other groups join in equity over time with the dominant group. The ones that Eric Voegelin talked about, closed empires versus ecumenical empires. And the closed empires are often the dominance of one racial group, of one familial group, and they result in extreme penalty upon the periphery. And they tend to be dated. They tend not to last as long, though it's difficult to say that because you're not comparing like with like, as time seems to be speeding up, if you will. Whereas the empires that seem to last and create an extensive legacy are those that allow structures of participation. And what ends empires is when you don't allow those structures of participation for those who you rule. So in the end, empire as a successful project has to have a teleology of shared rule. And this again is the Roman genius. So Rome was able to be stable because after extremely violent and bloody conquest, think of if you read what Caesar did in Gaul, it sort of gives you nightmares. But you very quickly allowed the landmass that you conquered to be the source of governance. Roman Caesars after Augustus often came from the periphery, and the periphery could govern the center. Rome created all structures of conditional citizenship. Most of the barbarians that invaded Rome at the end of it all wanted to be Roman. They didn't want to overthrow Rome, they wanted to continue Rome. because everybody saw the virtue of Rome and the benefits it brings. I mean, that's what St. Augustine talks about in the City of God. He doesn't deny the benefits of empire. So the thesis is broadly that empire is the logic of human civilization itself, that we haven't escaped from it, that nation states are not an interruption of empire, but are rather its continuance unbeknownst to the actors themselves, and that the real debate is between what one might call closed empires, which is the enforcement of the rule of one racial group or one familial group or one dynasty, over more open or ecumenical empires.
So focusing in on the universals, because one thing that you've told me before is that American conservatism, especially in this era, ought not to abandon the universals for the particulars. So what is the content of those universals, and what do we risk by losing them?
Yeah, I mean, the way I make the distinction between, if you can forgive me putting it like this, between good empires and bad empires, is bad empires invert the relationship between particulars and universals. So bad empires enforce the rule of particulars. That particular group, that particular racial group, that particular dynastic group. And it enforces that rule over a relatively diverse people. And the people who are far from that group pay a penalty for being far from that group, i.e. pay a penalty for the distinction. Whereas empires that succeed more lead with the universal. They lead with an idea that different people of different locale, culture, language, race can participate or share in the very thick idea of a universal that is created. Now, within that distinction, you're right to ask, what are the universals that we should uphold? So where I think many American post-liberal thinkers go wrong is they overreact to the liberal capture of universals. So liberalism, quite rightly in my view, says there are universals, but it says those universals are liberal universals. And liberal universals are paradoxically a denial of universals. There is no God, there is no objective truth, and even if there was, you couldn't possibly know it. As a result, the liberal world denies people any access to universals because it claims that it doesn't exist, and creates a state to police the fragmented individuals who can't form consensus around said universals. And what the American post-liberals have done is thrown the baby out with the bathwater. They've said, let's abandon universals. Universals is kind of all the bad stuff, it's Vietnam, it's Iraq, it's the liberals leading us into endless war. Peace lies in particularity, and what we need to do are build high walls, shelter behind them, and circle the wagons somewhere in the desert, and we want everyone to leave us alone, and we won't have anything to do with anybody. This seems to me to be a very retrograde understanding and a very pagan understanding. And given that so many post-liberals in America rightly are Christian, a very un-Christian understanding. And I think that what American liberals would be American conservatives would be better doing is exploring the political philosophy that comes along with Christianity, which is the universal brotherhood of all people, which is a worldwide social commitment to the flourishing of all and the achievement of such. And the universals that are upheld by a Christian approach aren't something as insane as a Christian nationalism. There's no such thing as a Christian nationalism, and there never can be a Christian nationalism, because Christianity is the overcoming of ethnic distinction. If you remember St. Paul's comments, do you not realize you're all equal, Greek or Jew, man, woman, free man or slave. The Christian promise is the radical equity of all human beings and the delivery of such. And what the Christian empires were articulating, at least in theory, if not in practice, was exactly that. Mm-hmm. And indeed, fast forward almost a century from the Middle Ages, it's the upholding of the notion of universal, the radical universality of human beings and of all being born in the image of God that led to the war of the British Empire against slavery, that was extensive, that lasted many generations, and that freed hundreds of thousands of slaves on the high seas, in the transport of them from Africa, where they were interceded by the Royal Navy. So there's a sense in which American thinkers and nationalist thinkers in Europe need to understand that that before the modern age, there was deep Christian thinking about empire and what it meant. And if you think of the modern age, what is the great killer of the modern age? The great killer of the modern period, especially in Europe, is the separation from the papacy and the invention of national blood and language groups. Mm. This led to the so-called, to endless warfare on the European continent. The breaking of the Pax Christiana, the breaking of the idea of that there should be peace between Christian peoples and that there's a loyalty of such, is at one with the break with the papacy in the 14th century, with anyone from Philip the Fair of France to Edward Longshanks in Britain. And what you had there in the 14th century is an assertion by European monarchs to be popes in their own country, to rule with their own autocracy, and to foster what one might call an incipient nationalism. And that gradually became the logic of the nation states. And that gradually became the logic of permanent warfare. Fast forward that implant that into the unavoidable logic of empire, and give that a racial kind of slant, as you did with Nazi Germany, and you have the logic of the killing machine. And we forget that what Christianity did was bring universal peace to Europe. We forget the peace of God movement at the end of the 10th century, and the fact that Christianity engaged in the most massive act of disarmament across Europe, and the making of violence as taboo. And what we have to do, I think, is reunite empire with idealism and stop the facile idea of empire as just exploitative, as just to do with harm against people. It had that element, and we shouldn't deny that, but there is a dialectical relationship that is inevitable, where you gradually raise those who you initially oppressed into full participation in your own order. And it's the sense that with Christianity, you had that from the beginning, at least theoretically, as an attempt to create political, social, and economic equity for all peoples. And that, I think, is the logic that post-liberals in America need to understand. So they stop advocating for nationalism that is clearly unchristian, not good, and has numerous deleterious consequences, none of which are conservative.
So let me give you a reading of the world that I think is pretty common among either American post-liberals or American nationalists. And you can tell me where you think this reading goes wrong, right? So whatever benefits may have accrued to the United States through American empire, let's say, in the aftermath of World War II, the fact that the world, sort of the international order was built in a way that kind of preferenced American interests. If you look at the last 50 years, obviously you have, I guess maybe the big victory for American empire is the Cold War, right? But if you look at kind of America's kind of military intervention, you have Vietnam, then you have, the era that I grew up in, 9/11, the war on terror, with sort of overthrowing Saddam Hussein, you have 1 million Christians displaced, you have just failures of the failures of liberal hegemony are very apparent. Alongside of these military adventures, you have globalization, which, totally, especially as China entered the World Trade Organization, totally deindustrialized the heartland of America, the very heartland that was necessary for us to be the arsenal of democracy in World War II. So you have this kind of litany of failures, both economically and militarily. And then we have the situation with the war in Ukraine. And if you look at that situation, it's hard for me not to see it like this. America made a promise that we wouldn't expand our military alliance past Poland. We continued to push it further and further, closer to Russia. A country like Ukraine, right, that was sort of a part of the historic Russian Empire, or at least sort of a buffer state on the edge of this empire, was under Russian influence. We, through the CIA, right, helped to orchestrate a coup with the Maidan Revolution in 2014. This created a situation sort of, supercharged then by Western progressive liberalism, which is the the principal ideology animating a lot of the continental Western powers, where a regional hegemon like Russia saw this as a civilizational threat. And I make no excuses for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. I think it's horrific. I think it was not only a moral mistake, I think it was a strategic mistake for him. And I think we're living in a travesty, right? But I just don't, if I look through the vantage point of the United States, I think I see China as the greatest military threat. I see that we have, 30 plus trillion in debt. We have massive crises here at home. We can't even secure our own southern border. And to me, it seems like pretty straightforward, right? There has to be peace in Ukraine, right? That would likely involve Russia keeping some of the territory that it took, Ukraine remaining neutral, remaining a buffer state, right? Not fully joining Europe, nor fully being absorbed into Russia. And America kind of reprioritizing our limited military resources towards ensuring that China doesn't become the global hegemon. And I think you would have an America that then has security of its borders, a strong kind of national identity and independence in the continental United States. You would have America. Okay, if you stop there, that could be the isolationist vision, but that's not what I'm saying. Then you have America and you say, we dominate in the Western Hemisphere. We don't allow China or any other kind of Russia, whoever, to interfere in the inner workings. We're not going to allow China to bring a military alliance to Mexico, right? So we dominate in the Western Hemisphere. And then from there, I think we try to control the common spaces, right? The seas, maintain superiority in these spaces. And I think from my vantage point, in light of limited resources and the profound debt and challenges that we have, that is a world in which we then cooperate with India, China, Russia, Europe, Brazil, in a way that there may be more, it's a multipolar world, not necessarily because I think a multipolar world is inherently superior, but just from a sense of realism, I just don't know if universal American empire is possible anymore. And to the extent that it is possible, in light of the fact that all of our permanent bureaucracies in Washington, D.C., the entire State Department is filled by people who believe things that are antithetical to what the West has stood for historically, the Christian West, at least, that you're talking about. I don't know if we'd even want it to be a universal empire.
Okay, so where to begin? Let's begin where you ended. This is an example of what I call, this is an example of wanting your cake and eating it. You can't, on the one hand, be arguing for isolationism, and then on the other hand, be arguing that you are free to secure the spheres you want to secure. There isn't the happy intermediate ground that you describe. To go to Europe, if America cedes Ukraine to Russia in whatever sense that is, the whole of Europe, or much of Europe, will be lost to America for various reasons. America, if you think of Trump and the potential or actual threats to the withdrawal of NATO, the Western polity will essentially evaporate as commonly understood. Russia itself has only been able to secure itself because America bought into Russian propaganda. The Americans alone, arguably, with the exception of the Germans maybe, bought into the idea that we must desperately not escalate because the consequences of escalation are nuclear war. This is facile. Nuclear weapons are undeployable and unusable. They only work against the American political consciousness, and that is their sole salience. The reason we have a prolongation of the Ukrainian conflict is half-hearted support by the Biden administration and the State Department therein that wanted a stalemate from the very beginning. It's why the Ukrainians have not been given the resources they need, despite their willingness to sacrifice their lives against Russian incursion. The nature of, I know Ukraine very well. I've been going there for years. I have family there. Ukraine has never been won with Russian or Soviet dominance. The Ukrainian resistance fought against Russia into the middle of the 1950s, a very barbaric, very brutal war. Under no circumstances are they happy with any form of Russian domination. They always have been a culture that wants something different from the imposition of Moscow. And that hasn't been led by the great Satan, hasn't been led by America, hasn't been. I don't agree with any of this narrative about NATO encouraging or any of this. They simply want to be part of another system and another empire and don't want to be part of the Russian settlement. And as I said earlier, this is part of the logic of empire, and we have to take a side in this. This isn't something we can recuse from, because I do think the prospect of a Russian victory then renders the entire European continent unstable. And Macron, for all of his faults, really recognizes and grasps this. And I do think the Baltics then become the target. I'll just finish and then come back to this. America by itself cannot dominate the world island. America by itself cannot secure its own borders. If it loses Europe, it loses its crucial foot in Eurasia and severely weakens itself against any coming conflict with China. The history of the world is you only win through alliances in your empire. You can never win by yourself. And the vision proposed is essentially a much reduced and diminished America, where you won't be able to beat, even now, China on its own domain, in its own near abroad. and China itself will make inroads with the various populist parties and convert nations friendly to America and hostile to China to neutral. So I think there is no opt-out for America from this. I would rather have an American-controlled space than a space of anarchy or the space of a Chinese-controlled world. And they are the only choices open to us. Yeah. There is no other option. The world you describe is either a world of anarchy and therefore a war of all against all, or a Chinese-dominated world. And I suggest to you, as somebody, that is not a world America should want. Second comment, all of the wars that you talk about are indeed liberal wars, and they are errors. You know, the invasion of Iraq is an ongoing error. But just because they are liberal wars and wars fought for the wrong sort of deranged, it's a kind of deranged union of nationalism and liberalism, does not mean all wars are wrong and all wars shouldn't be fought. And that there can be another, what I'm arguing for is something other than waging mass war in order that people look like us, which is essentially what's happened. And that's what I'm arguing for. And so a recalibration of the West, in my view, along the lines I've described, is, I think, the only thing that can properly protect America and American interests and Western interests. And that has historically always been. Empires fall when they make the moves that you're describing. And for Europe at the moment, the war in Ukraine is existential. And Ukraine would have won it if the Biden administration hadn't bought into this deranged logic of escalation, something which, unfortunately, the Republican Party has now. And it's that has prolonged the war. So that's my point of view as a European.
I guess I would agree to disagree in the sense of I don't think there would be a war, right, if we didn't have the Biden administration. And I think the war would be over, right?
And you would have mass terror and mass executions in Ukraine and Kiev. And we will not stand for that as Britons and as Europeans.
I understand that. That may be your fight more than I think it's ours.
It probably is. So, and I agree with that. But this is the role of the hegemon. And this is kind of, when the hegemon stops being the hegemon, which is what is happening, the hegemon then loses to another hegemon. And that's where we are.
What about this? Is there any world, is there any scenario where instead of China and Russia being driven together, where Russia becomes part of the West and the whole of the West, with India, with the United States, collectively resists China's hegemony?
Look, I think that's a lucid point. I mean, if you're making a strategic point that's a disaster of Western diplomacy to push China and Russia together, I would agree with you. But we are not the prime cause in this. You know, the prime cause in this lies in the logic of Russian nationalism and its empire. And also let's remember that we're back in the world of Samuel Huntington. You know, it's time to recover the efficacy and perspicacity of that analysis. We are in a war of civilizational states. And like it or not, there is a civilizational state between Russia and America and the other kind of countries that we might call the Anglosphere, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, etc. That we are all a civilizational state, and that civilizational state is worthy of defense and needs to be defended. And this is where I think your point kind of buys into my argument. Would I like to envisage Russia joining that? Of course I would, theoretically. I would like to envisage that expanding. and that would provide a proper bulwark. But I don't think it can do so under liberalism, which is which is the. But if we recover something like the values of Europe that are pre-liberal or post-liberal now, then that could happen. Then that, well, theoretically, I don't think it can happen practically.
Level.
Theory
100 years from now, 200 years from now.
Yeah, but you're right. You're right, Teresa. That is the end to which one could legitimately aspire. And then again, you see, this is very interesting, because then again, we start to fall back into Huntington's thesis. You're saying, could we have a global alliance and call the West Global Alliance of Christian Nations? And then that immediately moves beyond what we would typically think of as the West, because what do you do when China becomes the most populous Christian nation? How does that change? How does that
Africa
change?
Could already be on its way.
Well, Africa is the most populous Christian continent and is the source of the massive increase in Christian per capita adherence as we go forward. So that brings another dimension of empire, that the ideational struggle isn't just with, if one might call it, nation-state empires like China or Russia. It's also with ideational empires like Islam. So it's back with kind of regional polities kind of understood and authored by religion. And that's also a dimension of the conflict we're now in. And since we believe in nothing, and we're so highly polarized around values and around ideation, that ideational conflict is one that we're even more vulnerable in respect of.
Yeah. So I have two more questions, and I want to slowly move away now from these particular examples back to more universals. Why is it, the first one, why is it that empires need to be universal? Why not have a world, unless you think it's just an inferior world, a multipolar world where there's 2 empires, 3 empires, and they each dominate a sphere?
Well, you probably do and will always have. As I said earlier, no empire in human history has ever dominated,
the whole globe.
The whole globe. It's never dominated the world island.
I mean, Rome was sort of it was a universe. It was the known Western world, but it wasn't. Some stuff was still going on in China.
Now, what we're seeing though is perhaps a change, something very, very different, because now values are starting to dominate the whole world. The phenomenon of the great sort is that, what people believe in Wisconsin is becoming what people believe in Buenos Aires, or, what people believe in potentially in Jakarta. So you're having a situation where people from different nations are starting to exhibit the same behavior and the same values because we've globalized social media. And so the globalization of social media and social understanding, where, certain conflicts like that are regional between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip become global. And that becoming global sorts populations, resorts and radicalizes the Islamic populations, for example, of European countries and America as well, and repolarizes. So in this context, it could be possible, if you have ideational dominance of the world, that under new technology, one empire might be able to govern the world. The point isn't, though, and I go to your point, why can't we just have many flowers and many states? The point is because we never have, and we never will. And the argument for that is that smaller polities only exist because of larger polities. So all of the understanding of nation states that we have only exist in peace because of the empire that backs them. So if you think of Europe, if the British and American empire hadn't intervened, there wouldn't be nation states in Europe now. It would be governed, there'd be the Soviet Union of Western Europe, or a German racial empire. So nation states only exist in peace if they're secured by the empire. absent the empire, you have a Hobbesian world, a war of all against all. And it would be a bit like the Greek world of the 5th or the 4th century, which is rampant warfare of all against all. And the level of bloodletting and killing was so extreme that there's a list of about 200 or 300 political settlements or cities that were entirely wiped off the face of the planet. So the condition for peace, the condition for plurality, is not plurality. Paradoxically, the condition for plurality is a hegemon that allows there to be peace and that secures peace under its auspices. And this is one of the fundamental reasons for empire. That empire essentially creates peace because the consequences of challenging these the states that exist under the auspices of the empire mean conflict with the empire. And conflict with the empire is too high a cost to pay. So if you want peace, which is what you suggest, you must have empire.
On that note, let's wrap up. Thanks for joining, Philip.
Thank you.